So we're going to get the program started. I'm really excited to be introducing our first speaker. I've been interacting with her quite a bit over the past year on Twitter. She just has a great energy, really fun, but also very informative, always coming with some really fun things on Twitter, but also very inspiring. So our keynote today is coming from Dr. Tana Joseph. She's an astronomer, a science communicator, and a transformation advocate, as well as an entrepreneur. Her research focuses on binary star systems containing black holes located outside of our Milky Way galaxy. In 2013, she completed her PhD in physics at the University of Southampton. She was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship, followed by a Royal Society Newton International Fellowship. In 2018, she founded a STEM communications and consulting company called Astrocoms. And this company helps STEM practitioners to effectively communicate their research. They offer technical consulting and advisory services to policymakers, the media, creative industries, and the education sector. Thank you so much, Tana, for being here. I'm so excited. I think everyone's really excited to hear your talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. So that introduction actually covered a lot of my talk, so you're really well primed for the chat today. So let me share my screen and move on without further ado. So today I'm going to be talking about my journey into astronomy, how I became an astronomer, and it's a long journey, but I am excited to take you down that path and talk to you about what it's like to be an African scientist, especially abroad. So I want to start this talk by acknowledging my privilege, and it may seem to some people, whether you're African or not, whether you're Black or not, that I'm a Black person, I'm South African, I was born during apartheid, all these kind of things, but I still have a tremendous amount of privilege, and it's very important when giving talks like this to acknowledge that, so that we don't always compare. You know, you can't do a like-for-like, one-to-one comparison of someone's journey if you don't know the full story. And part of that story is that I come from a quite middle-class background. I was raised bilingual, so I spoke English and Afrikaans. I attended English medium schools, and in the very specific South African context, especially in the context of the apartheid regime that classified South Africans into different race groups, I am colored, although I identify as Black now as well. And as a colored person, I had a lot of privilege over my Black compatriots. So we, as colored people, had better access to education, we had better housing, etc. And that plays an important role in all kinds of attainment. And both my parents were university educated or are university educated. So I am not a first generation student. I'm not even a first generation postgraduate student because my mother has an honors degree. So so this is all the privilege that goes into this. So when you engage with me and hear my talk that's coming up, always have at the forefront of your mind the idea that I already had a head start compared to the overwhelming majority of people in my country, South Africa, compared to many other Africans, even compared to some of my European counterparts when I was doing my PhD, and I'll talk more about that later. I was the only person in my friend group during my PhD, and we were about 12 of us. I was the only one, for instance, whose mother had gone to university. Many of the rest of my friends, their fathers had university degrees, but their mothers didn't. So I had more privilege in that way than even white Europeans. And these things are very important to take into account when we are giving these inspirational talks, or when you inevitably try and measure yourself up to someone else. You don't know the full story unless they tell you the full story. So I'll start with my journey now and what I call the pre-astronomy years. So these are photos of me. The one on the left-hand side is a photo of me taken in 1990. So I wasn't even technically really in school. That time we still called it preschool. My school, Welcome Primary School, had a preschool, and that was in 1990. So that's the year apartheid ended. And the picture on the right-hand side is me at 8 years old, in grade 2 in 1992, in those days in South Africa. We call that sub B, substandard B, for any older South Africans listening. And this is my school uniform, and this is the school I attended, was Welcome Primary School. And at the time, it was a race-segregated school on the Cape Flats in Cape Town, in the Athlone area. And by the time I left the school to attend another school, I had some black classmates, so that would have been 94, 95. We started having some black classmates, but due to the way that the system is still set up in South Africa, no white classmates. And this is before I knew I wanted to be an astronomer, but due to the fact that both of my parents were high school science teachers, my father taught maths and physics, and my mother taught life sciences. So those days it was called biology, just biology. And so science was always a part of our growing up in our household, like my parents being teachers. If you know any teachers, you know they don't always switch off when they come home. So there were lots of lessons and lots of things pointed to us, and we were encouraged to ask questions of our parents. This was before the internet and smartphones. So you basically had the choice of going to the library to find something out, or if your family had a set of encyclopedias, or in my case, I was extremely lucky. I had two well-educated science teachers who could give me answers to most of my questions. And then when I was about 11 years old, that's when I decided to become an astronomer. And here's a picture of me on the right in a different school uniform. You can notice it's all blue. And I am now at Pinelands Primary School. Pinelands is a formerly whites-only suburb in South Africa. And at this stage, my parents had enough money to send me to what we call in South Africa a former Model C school. So Model C schools were state-funded schools in South Africa that were reserved only for whites during apartheid, and now they'd become integrated in the 90s. And at around that time, so I was about 11 or 12 years old in this picture. So at 11 years old, I started seeing photos from the Hubble Space Telescope, pictured here on the left-hand side. That shiny tin can satellite there is the greatest astronomical instrument that the world has ever produced, the Hubble Space Telescope. Most people have heard of it. It's probably the most famous telescope in the world. And our local newspaper in Cape Town, the Cape Times, used to publish the photos, these incredible photos from the Hubble Space Telescope, on their front page when a particularly beautiful one came out. And those of you who had a keen eye might have noticed that my cover screen is, you can see in the bottom there's the credit, it's the Hubble Space Telescope. This is a photo of the Andromeda Galaxy. Some of you who had Macs a few years ago, this was the kind of default background. So that's not a computer-generated image. That is a photo that the Space Telescope took, and it's so incredibly beautiful and detailed. And when I was about 11, my father would buy the newspaper every day. And when he was done with it, then it was a thing I did. I would read through the newspaper, and I started seeing these incredibly beautiful, detailed pictures. And I would read the article, and I would cut out the article and the picture and keep it in a scrapbook. And then at some point, I realized that these images aren't just beautiful photos of galaxies or clouds or things like that out in space, that they were actually scientific data sets, and that there's a group of scientists that use these photos to study things out in space. And that's when I started becoming more interested in astronomy and decided to become an astronomer myself. So this was about 1995, and I was about 11 years old. So before I go on, I want to bring your attention to a famous quote by a famous scientist called Louis Pasteur. So those of you, for those who don't necessarily know, Louis Pasteur is the one who invented pasteurization. It's named after him, that process of heating up milk to kill the germs so that you don't get sick. So pasteurization was invented and popularized by Louis Pasteur. And he says that in the field of observation, chance favors the prepared mind, or fortune favors the prepared mind. And I bring this up here now because the kind of work I do is observational astronomy. We use telescopes and other detectors to make observations about the universe and learn more about it. And experimentation is similar. So if you work in a wet lab, that kind of thing. And he says that chance favors the prepared mind. So when I was 11, I decided I was going to be an astronomer. And my parents were 100% unwaveringly on board. And I credit their support as the main reason that I got my PhD even in the first place, or even studied, because they never stopped believing in me. So my mind was prepared by my parents, by their support, by my studies, to be able to take advantage of any good fortune or any luck that comes my way. So luck is often involved in a lot of success stories, and people don't want to acknowledge that because it makes it seem like they didn't work hard. But there's people that say it's better to be lucky than good. And in some circumstances, that is true. And I think in a lot of people's careers, luck plays a big role, but you have to be prepared. Like Louis Pasteur said, you have to have other things in place to get you in that situation. And then when the opportunity comes along, you have prepared and you can actually take up that opportunity. So by the time I got to matric, this is a photo of me on the right in my blue blazer, at Pinelands High School. This is my matric, so my final year of high school. And you can see the gray edging, the gray braiding on my blazer, and that's to indicate that I had academic full colors. So I was flying that nerd flag. I was a black nerd in the 90s and the early 2000s, before Barack Obama made it cool in 2008. I didn't dim my shine, and I took a lot of pride in my academic achievements. And again, my parents also made it very clear to us that this is something they expect from us. And our prize givings at school was like, my parents are like, they loved that. It was like their ball, basically. They would come out every year and support my sisters and I, and get to cheer for us. And so they made it, in our home, it was normalized that academic achievement is extremely important and something we have to work towards. And at the same time, this luck or this fortune that I just spoke about was starting to unfold. So I was prepared. I had my support system in place. I was doing the right subjects to go and study physics at university. And around that time, the South African government commissioned, along with other international partners, a telescope to be built in South Africa, in the Northern Cape, near the town of Sutherland, called the Southern African Large Telescope. And it is the largest optical telescope in the Southern Hemisphere. It has a mirror that is 10 meters big. And so by the time I got to matric, this idea of like, oh my gosh, like, you want to become an astronomer, that's so weird, like, we don't do that in South Africa. And then by the time I got to matric, the landscape had literally changed so much that we were now building these world-class instruments in South Africa. And by the time I graduated with my first degree, my BSc, you can see a photo of me getting capped there at my graduation in my little gown. The SALT telescope on the right-hand side is a picture. It had been completed. So the conversation then around my journey and my studies and my ambitions changed from, why do you want to do space stuff? We don't do that in South Africa. That's like, you have to go to America. That's NASA. To, oh, are you going to work on the SALT telescope in Sutherland? And so people's outlook and understanding of opportunities in South Africa had started to change, and I didn't have to explain myself so much anymore. And so things were starting to sync up, and it was becoming a lot easier to follow this path. And then I did my master's degree also at the University of Cape Town, where I did my undergraduate degrees. And I went and did my PhD in the UK, abroad. And I was at the University of Southampton. Here's a photo of me probably in the first week that I arrived there. And I'm standing outside the building for the School of Physics and Astronomy. And I was extremely lucky as a student in a lot of ways that my PhD advisor or my supervisor is an American guy. And at the time, so this was early 2009, and if you cast your mind back to around that time, that was the time of the great financial crash of 2008, not to be confused with the great financial crash of 2020, because we keep living through these once-in-a-lifetime economic crashes. So I was in my PhD program at the time of great financial instability and a lot of funding cuts. And luckily for me, my supervisor, who has a lot of connections in the US, was able to get me funding to travel to the US rather than as a replacement for me not being able to access funding as a foreign student in Britain because they had cut a lot of the funding. And you can see the badge there. That's the old logo for the CFA, the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, where I spent 6 months of my PhD. So I was studying abroad on my study abroad. I was possibly the first, or definitely one of the first, and I don't think anyone has been there after me, the first South African to work at the High Energy Astrophysics Division of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. So that was another opportunity I was able to, to be able to get and to make very good use of. So I had a lot of networks and connections in the US as well as the UK and Europe during my studies. And then I graduated from my PhD in 2013, and all this time while I was away, astronomy was growing in South Africa, especially in the area of radio astronomy. Now, some of you might have heard of the Square Kilometer Array, the SKA or MeerKAT, and this is the idea to build the world's biggest and best radio telescope on Earth, partly in South Africa and partly in Australia. And in 2012, South Africa and Australia were awarded joint hosting rights. And so by the time I finished my PhD in 2013, we had built a prototype telescope, pictured here on the left, made up of 7 antennas. So if you can think of a satellite dish, but instead of like a satellite dish size, it's 13 meters across. And they're all linked up, all these 7 are linked up electronically, and they act as one telescope. And then, so by the time I finished my PhD, we had this instrument called CAT-7. And we had started building the precursor to the Square Kilometer Array telescope called MeerKAT, which is done now and consists of 64 of these type of dishes that you see here on the left. I immediately came back to South Africa, to Cape Town, after completing my PhD. And I worked at the University of Cape Town, where I was the first woman of color, first Black woman to receive a SK Africa postdoctoral fellowship. And so that already tells you a little bit about the numbers game here, where it took me in 2013 to be the first woman of color to get this award, but it's for an organization, an institution and research facility that's based in Africa and based in South Africa. So how come I was the first? So that gives you an inkling of the other issues that are still at play. And then when I finished that postdoc, I went and worked at the South African Astronomical Observatory, which is only about 3 kilometers away from the University of Cape Town. And I was the outreach astronomer. So I did research and outreach, and it was honestly such a dream job. And the 2 images you can see in the center there. So the picture of me on the right-hand side is a picture of me next to the sundial at the observatory. This observatory is 200 years old. So it's literally a colonial institution. It was set up by the British as part of their navigational strategy to extend their empire. And the building you can see there in the middle on top, that is part of the original buildings that were built in 1820. And the image you can see below that, all those structures there, that is SALT in the back there, the biggest dome, and all the other small telescopes that are run by the observatory. And they're not all South African telescopes, but we have such great dark skies and such good weather advantage in South Africa, especially in the Northern Cape, that there are telescopes from Poland, Germany, Korea, Japan, to name a few. I think there might be others now as well. They come and they build the telescopes in the Northern Cape because we have such a good advantage of dark skies. So it's a very international community, and we are making the most of our dark skies and the facilities available to us as South Africans. And then I went abroad again. I finished my time at the observatory, and I was awarded, halfway through my time at the observatory, I was awarded a Fulbright fellowship, and I took it up at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. And that was a really fun time. And then straight after that, I went to the University of Manchester in Northwest England to be a Royal Society Newton International Fellow. And you can see some pictures there of me. And again, just a fantastic time. I've really grown a lot as a researcher and also as a science communicator. And during this time, I also started my company, Astrocoms. And it was it was a very busy time. So this was about from 2017 to 2020. I was busy with these ventures. So I had all these great opportunities to get these fellowships and study abroad, and again, grow my network and learn more about research from people all over the world. And so what I'm doing now in 2020, so what happened was at the beginning of the year, for those who remember March in the before times. So, my fellowship at the University of Manchester ended, and I was able to renew my visa, and then lockdown hit. So I've been in the UK because South Africa closed their airspace, so we couldn't really return home. And so I'm just doing what I can here, working from home the same as everyone else. And in this time, I have continued to work with Astrocoms as a freelancer. I also work with a fantastic charitable organization called the STEMETS. And the STEMETS is a social enterprise that works with girls, young women, and non-binary young people to get them into STEM, and not necessarily STEM academia, but STEM careers, get them STEM qualifications and mentor them. And it's just and they do this all for free at no cost to the participants. And I am their data analyst. So I work with them on basically participant satisfaction, collecting the data from all the events, making reports for them, for their partners, etc. And about a month ago, I officially became a part-time postdoctoral fellow at the University of Amsterdam, working with Professor Sarah Markov and Professor Samaya Nisanke as my two bosses. So I have two female bosses, and in one of my groups, in Professor Sarah Markov's group, where we work on these X-ray binary sources that were mentioned in my introduction, where one of the components of this double star system is a black hole. We study these sources, and we study how they interact with each other and the environment. And the first time I attended one of these group meetings, so this just shows you that my journey is still ongoing, and I thought I'd seen and done it all at this stage of my career. And I had the amazing experience of being not the only Black woman in my research group. There's another Black woman in one of my research groups, and it's literally the first time that has ever happened to me. I was shaking. It was unbelievable. I had to tweet about it. I couldn't believe it. And I was trying to act cool. I'm like, just act cool. Act like you've seen another Black woman doing astronomy before. Like, it's fine. It's going to be fine. It's just like, you want to be a friend. You don't want her to think you're a weirdo. Just be chill. You got this. But it just made me realize in that moment that while I have had the great fortune and privilege and honor to be able to work with many Black women scientists, Black women astronomers, other women of color, astronomers, LGBT astronomers. In my own research group, I was always the only Black woman, and I've shown you all the places I've worked and studied. And it took now 7 years post-PhD for me to finally be in a research group where I'm not the only Black woman. And that kind of in turn leads me to my last slide, and where I'm just going to quickly talk about diversity and inclusion and decolonization advocacy, which I am now also doing, and so that science is for everyone, and that we still have such a long way to go to the point where we as Africans are represented at all levels in research, in all different kinds of research, and that it's not just privileged people, relatively privileged people like myself, who need to be held up as as role models, and because that often segues and leads into tokenism, and we don't want that. We want to be there as full, real, self-actualized researchers with our own thoughts and techniques and expertise. And talking to this audience here today, talking to you all, and being invited to be a keynote speaker at this conference is very gratifying. I'm very humbled, and it's also just it's the first of many, and it's going to be the first step onto bigger and better and more wonderful things for Africans in STEM. And as we said during the World Cup, it's time for Africa, and we include, all Black people in this space, and whatever that means for you. But science is really for everyone, and hopefully the upshot of all of this work that we're doing and all of these connections that we're making is that very soon none of us will have to have that reaction that I had, where I realized I'm finally not alone in a research group. That will be a thing of the past, and that seeing Africans thriving, surviving, and leading the way, trailblazing in STEM is going to become very commonplace. So thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate you tuning in, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Tana. That was such a fantastic presentation. I've just been sitting here smiling, laughing at points. And actually, first of all, before I continue giving you praise, I just want to thank you for starting your presentation with acknowledging your privileges and giving context to your presentation in that way, because I do think that's really important, because a lot of the times we do compare each other, right? We see other people doing well, and we don't realize that often people's journeys, they start with context of certain privileges, to come from a middle-class family versus a lower or upper class. And thank you for acknowledging that. But yeah, such a fascinating journey, and it was so inspiring. So I have a few questions of my own, but I'm going to first check some questions from the attendees. So first a question from Natasha, Natasha. What would you like the attendees to know more about astronomy, and what advice would you give to a person who would want to pursue astronomy as a career?
I'm going to say the same thing that a lot of my colleagues will say, that astronomy and astrology are different. Astrology is stuff about star signs, and astronomy is basically studying the physics of things out there in space. And that one thing that's maybe not so obvious as well to people who aren't in the astronomy space, especially in an African context and a South African context, people often ask why we're building these telescopes when, we need to build schools, we need to build toilets in schools, we don't have enough teachers and all that kind of stuff. And I'd like people to be more aware of the development opportunities that come along with astronomy, the development that is done when we build these big installations. And they're not without their problems. There's problematic issues with that, with building on indigenous land and all that kind of stuff. But the infrastructure that's built and the opportunities that are given to local people in the African context, we are very mindful, for instance, with the SKA and with building SALT, that there be development opportunities for the local people, because the Karoo area of South Africa it's mostly sheep. There's way more sheep than people. Very few people live there. It's in a semi-desert/desert area. And these people have to make sacrifices, unfortunately, when these telescopes are built. So for instance, if you live near a radio telescope, you have to be very careful how you use your microwave, and you can't really use your cell phone. And so to compensate for that, the SKA has put in fiber, fast fiber, into the town Carnarvon, which is nearby, to compensate for that. And they have the fastest internet in Africa, where a lot of them didn't have access to internet before the SKA started putting in development money into the town. None of the children at Carnarvon High School had ever qualified to go to university. There was no qualified maths and physics teachers at this school. And the situation has changed now, such that a group of students from Carnarvon, I think 3 or 4 of them, went to an international robotics competition and won one of the top prizes. So they went from when they left, and they were young high school, they were like grade 8 and grade 9. When they started school, there was no maths and science to be done in high school. By the time they got to high school, they were able to win international robotics challenge competitions. So this is the kind of development that goes along with these installations. It wasn't always the case, but now we're more aware of social justice issues, and we're trying to do our science in line with that ethos of social justice in mind.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. That what can come out of actually making sure that we have the development on the continent, because I think that does need to change, shifting from us having to leave to be able to do the science.
Absolutely.
Ways to invest in institutions and development projects on the continent, because it does provide employment for the people and development in the area. So such a brilliant point. So another question from Kim Tommy is, has the landscape in terms of astronomy changed in South Africa? Are we seeing more Black women entering and staying in the field?
Oh, that's a very good question, and it's quite nuanced. So the question about, are we seeing more Black women entering the field? Absolutely. Are we seeing them stay in the field? Not so much. And this is often where people, a lot of my colleagues or people who are, who do this kind of EDI or decolonization advocacy or outreach, they'll talk about that leaky pipeline. And I'm 100% against that. Because it's not a leaky pipeline. That is a cutesy name for it's because a leaky pipeline sounds like a problem. It sounds like, oh, if we just fix the pipeline because the pipeline's broken and people are leaking out. That is a cute name and a misnomer for a problem that is not actually a problem. As they say in computers, in the computer science world, they say it's not a bug, it's a feature. The system isn't broken. The system is working exactly like it should.
It was set up that way.
Up for women. It's not set up for any people of color. It's not set up for anyone who has a disability, or if you don't come from money. It's not set up for anyone who has family caring responsibilities. And in an African context, it's so impossible to separate those things out, because the academic culture is set up for single white middle class men who don't have any caring responsibilities and don't have to worry about money. And this was set up in the 17th century. And this pervasive westernized idea of how science should be done has spread out all over the globe. And in Africa, we now have enough momentum to change that and to say, for instance, another thing is there's always this debate, especially in the physics, in the hard science, about religion. How can you be religious and be an astronomer? And I'm sitting here with these European people arguing about this and Americans, and I'm like, wow, you guys really don't know any Black people. First of all, you don't know any Black scientists, because it's just what we do. I'm personally no longer practicing Christian, but I was raised Christian. I know many religious astronomers. And this idea that you can praise God and do science is not a foreign concept to us as Africans. But let me tell you, outside of Africa, they're struggling. They need our guidance. So this is just another example of how we need to start dictating our own research culture. And then that will start to solve this problem of the leaky pipeline. We must throw that phrase out of position, because it's not useful and it's obfuscating a real problem. And then we will naturally start to see more Black women progress all the way through to professor stage if they so wish, rather than being forced out because the system doesn't understand that that we have other commitments that are equally as important as science. Science isn't our whole world. Our family, our religion, other things like that are also equally important.
Absolutely amazing points. And I 100% agree about the need for us to define our own narrative as African scientists about what being an African scientist means. I guess that's kind of also the theme of this day, right? Because for too long have we been trying to kind of conform to like the Western kind of way that it's been set up. And it doesn't work a lot of the times with the way we're raised and the way our cultures work. So understanding how to practice science within the African context is going to be important going forward. But so many great points. Okay, another question from Ntokozisi. How do we get people to overcome the fear of science? In my experience working with high school students, they do want to do science, but have this fear which hinders them.
So a lot of work, or some work, there still needs to be more ongoing work, has been done on, for instance, what influences the choices that learners make at high school. Sorry for those who aren't South African. In South Africa, we call school pupils learners. What learners, and especially young women, what influences their decision. And some studies out of the US and the UK, so not necessarily applicable, but possibly giving some insight, is that parental support and consent is the number one factor into whether girls decide to take up science subjects to the end of high school. And that I think that has some merit in explaining a lot of what we're doing, or a lot of how we operate as Africans, because again, family is first and foremost in our lives. And if your parents are against something that you want to do, it's probably not going to happen. This is why I always, throughout my talk, keep saying my parents' unwavering support to this day of my academic and career choices. And that has been the number one determinant, because I didn't have role models like we do now. There was no internet. I literally had a newspaper. For the younger people, go ask your parents what a newspaper is. I had a newspaper in front of me, and I had my parents telling me that I can absolutely do this, and I'm that girl. So the way to overcome that fear is to look at the community as a whole. A child on their own in our kind of culture, in African culture, that can't be your target audience. You need to speak to teachers, you need to speak to parents, you need to speak to community leaders. This is we are all together in this. And if I didn't have my parents' support, I could have had everything else in the world. But if I didn't have my parents backing me up and, talking to other adults and saying, we believe our child can do this and we're going to help her do this, because of course there were lots of questions. Exactly coming from this place of maybe of fear or not understanding. So you need to have that, you need to have your family on board with you, and you need to have the community on board with you to be able to do this. So that's how you overcome that barrier, by making it a more holistic approach to getting people involved in science at whatever level they want to be involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely resonate with that. I think it's a very similar experience for me, that my parents were very supportive, and I can see that if that's not the case, it can be really difficult to be able to pursue the sciences, and even going on to do a PhD, like I'm doing neuroscience, it can be a very abstract thing to pursue. And indeed, I think I hope there are some African parents who are attending today, and just keep that in mind, that if your child wants to pursue STEM, it really is important to give them that support, because it really starts in the home. If you don't have that support, it's really challenging. Yeah, we still have time for more questions. Great. So Anne was asking, how do you deal with the imposter syndrome that came with being the first in many spaces you occupied?
So my imposter syndrome started kicking in at university, but it kicked in pretty late. And again, this comes down to my privilege of having two parents who were university educated. So I knew what it was to go to university. And I was actually even extra privileged, because not only did my parents attend university, they attended university while they were working, so part-time as adults, and I saw them go to university. I would see my parents sit with their textbooks. So I knew what was in store for me at university. I was also able to go to schools later on. Like I pointed out, I went to formerly whites-only schools in nice suburbs, and those schools prepared me for being around white people. So I tell people I have a lot of white people experience. So starting in 1996, I have decades of white people experience. And so being in a place filled with white people wasn't that intimidating for me by the time I got to university. And I was also exposed to my particular university, the University of Cape Town, because my school would enter us into things like maths Olympiads and stuff. So I actually knew the campus. I'd been to open days there when the recruiters used to come to our school from UCT. So I was very familiar. In fact, in my mind, I was never not going to UCT. I only applied to one university, and I knew I was going to get in. That's the confidence that comes from having my parents supporting me and putting me in the right places at the right time. So there's that enormous amount of privilege. Can you imagine me as a Black woman saying like, oh yeah, of course I was going to go to UCT, the best university in Africa. Like, where else was I going to go? I tried to apply to university in Joburg, and my parents said, you're not going to this, you're staying at home. So see there again, my parents directed me. They said, you're going to UCT? And I was like, yeah, I'm going to UCT. So the imposter syndrome really only started to kick in the further I studied. So maybe like from third year or honors, when things started to get tough. Because the thing is about our physics group was very small and very tight-knit. There was me and one other colored girl, and then 8 white boys and men. But they struggled just as much. When you see in that small group, when you're all being taken for a ride by quantum mechanics, you realize there's no difference. We all start, and quantum mechanics will humble you. Second year maths will humble you. And we all were in it together. And so my imposter syndrome only really started to grow when I had bad supervisors during my master's. And then it was massively rectified by my amazing supervisor during my PhD. And I would say to anyone who's suffering from imposter syndrome now, there's a few things you need to remember. It's not a personal failure. It's not a personal failure. It's a structural failure. The system is working like it should. It's the system, academic system is based on a lot of unpaid labor. And by keeping you feeling like an imposter, they're keeping you working harder for no money. If you work on weekends, that's free labor that they're getting, but you're like, oh my gosh, publish or perish, I'm not good enough, I need to apply to more things, I need to write more papers, I need to be in the labs overnight and stuff like that. That is, imposter syndrome is set up and not addressed by the system because they want to extract free labor from you. So recognize that. And recognize your self-worth and surround yourself with people who appreciate you. When I got on Twitter, my imposter syndrome disappeared. Like literally, it went away in 2018 because I was surrounded by people who kept shouting, yes, queen, my fave, and putting like fire emojis under everything I did. And I was like, these people at work know nothing. I am that girl. I am the girl I am the girl my parents told me in 1995 that I am. I went and found that girl with all the confidence again because the people on Twitter kept telling me how quiet I am. So surround yourself with people who big you up and who see your worth, and then internalize that and know your worth. And that's something I also learned with my company. It really helped. So I would say maybe find something outside of work that validates you, outside of research. I started my company, which I never thought I would do. And the success of that has also bolstered me as a researcher in these spaces, because I know if I'm successful in one thing, I'm probably successful in other ways as well. So find your support system, value yourself, and find something else that's maybe complementary to your science and let that help you. But also don't make science your whole identity. That's something that's very important. So it's different for different people. But for instance, on Twitter, I don't have astro anything in my name, in my handle. It's just my name. And my bio says, the first thing my bio says is that I'm South African and that I'm a feminist. Then it says I'm an astronomer, because those two things are much more important and a much bigger part of me. I will always be South African and I will always be a feminist, but I could decide tomorrow that I don't want to do astronomy anymore, that I'm not an astronomer. So don't attach your self-worth to your career path or your career title. That's very important for Sorry for that super long answer.
No. You had so many great points. I was just like clicking in my head, like, yes, Tana, just dropping gems all over. No, thank you for that. And I think what you said really reminded me of what Dr. Samira said yesterday, go where you're celebrated. As you were saying, go where you're validated. So if you're not on Twitter, I would advise you to get an account as well, because I also agree. Twitter is such a great place for meeting people who will celebrate you and other Africans in STEM, etc., and other people in other communities as well who just can see your brilliance. So final question from James. Did you at any point in your earlier pursuit reconsider your decision, I guess, to pursue the path that you went? And if so, do you mind sharing what caused it and how you maneuvered the challenges?
No, never. I never wavered from the age of 11. And the thing that happened, the unexpected thing that happened was when I got my PhD, I was 28 years old and I was at my graduation and I was standing there and not even like at my graduation, like I'd gotten my degree, but I hadn't had the graduation yet. And there was this lull, and it started to dawn on me that at 28 years old, I had achieved my life's goal. This is everything I've worked towards my whole life. And I achieved it. And now what? I'm not even 30 years old and now I'm done. And then it took me a few years to find another goal again that was that big, that was that meaningful. And my company is a big part of that. But I was in a wilderness, probably, I would say, for my first postdoc, because I was doing the science I wanted to do, but there was no other goal, because, again, that's the thing about separating your work from who you are as a person. So now as a person, I need to find another personal journey to go on. But in my career, I'd achieved everything. So I would say actually reaching your goal can sometimes be, you sometimes don't, you work so long and so hard. Like, almost 20 years in the making, and then you achieve it, and then you're like, oh no, now what? This is amazing. I've made it to the top of Everest. Now what else is there to conquer? Like, I think, what did they say? So, and Caesar wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. And luckily, I found that there are lots of other worlds to conquer. And this is why on my last slide, I showed I'm still involved in research. I still adore it, but I've branched out into other things as well, including, which I didn't talk too much about, but my equity, diversity, and inclusion and decolonization advocacy is really very meaningful to me now, and folding that into my science communication and sharing that with other people is extremely fulfilling. And so that's something that I'm going to, take on as the next leg of my journey through this life. But I will say, actually, I lied right at the beginning. I did have a moment where I thought I did the wrong thing, and it's all because of Twitter, because I follow so many scientists. There's this particular marine biologist who always posts amazing stuff of the animals that you see in the deep sea, and I was like, I made a mistake. Space is stupid. The real discoveries are in the ocean. So I'm like obsessed with marine biology right now. I love it.
That's funny. That's great. But yeah, Tana, thank you so much. This was such an incredible talk, an incredible conversation. We will put Tana's social media links in the chat for people who want to connect with her. But thank you so much for being here and for this amazing talk. We will definitely be connecting more after this.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for the amazing questions. And I look forward to the rest of the day. Goodbye, everyone.